Top diplomats from the G7 pledged to help Ukraine see through the coming winter as Russia continues its attack on civilian infrastructure.
Israeli forces have attacked what it claims is a rocket manufacturing site in Gaza. 4 rockets were fired into Israel in the latest cross-border exchange since August.
Top diplomats of the G7 gathered in Germany, vowing to help Ukraine see through the coming winter. The foreign representatives expressed concern over food shortages and the energy crisis as Russia continues its attack on civilian infrastructure.
They cannot occupy it, they cannot win in the military, in the battlefield, they cannot win the war, and they are destroying the country systematically. Millions of Ukrainians have no longer access to electricity. And what Putin is willing to do is to put the country in the darkness in the wintertime. This is a war crime.
Despite the advances of Ukrainian troops on the northeastern and southeastern fronts, a harsh winter is still expected for soldiers and civilians. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that more than 4.5 million people have lost access to electricity. But morale in the Ukrainian army is high as Kyiv's forces are preparing for a fierce battle to retake Kherson after the Russian puppet authorities of the city have renewed calls for the evacuation of civilians. Yevgeny Afineyevsky's new documentary, Freedom on Fire, shows up close the horrors of the war in Ukraine. The director had already been nominated a few years ago for an Oscar for his Euromaidan documentary. For this new film, he worked with more than 40 cameramen and conducted hundreds of interviews to show what it's like to live in a war zone. When asked about some EU countries' lack of involvement in the conflict, the director warned that history tends to repeat itself.
All these lessons need to be reminded. And I think people who are taking these decisions today in the government need to be thinking much more wisely, because they're jeopardizing lives of their own people who voted for them.
One of the main characters in the documentary is Hanna Yurkina, who was trapped for more than 60 days in the underground tunnels of the Azovstal steel factory in Mariupol with her baby, who was just a few months old at the time. Her husband is a prisoner of war, and to this day she still hasn't heard from him.
At one point I was going away from Azovstal, but from the other point my husband was still there. I feel responsibility to return him and to return other militaries who saved my life and who saved the life of my son.
Freedom on Fire was completed in just 6 months. The reason? To raise awareness of the conflict, which is slowly receiving less and less attention from the international community.
A popular route for those desperate to get into the European Union. The Polish-Belarusian border is still active, despite the construction of an intimidating wall. In recent days, attempts to cross the border have risen, despite the figure originally decreasing after the wall's construction, according to the country's border guard.
In the last operating day, we recorded 124 attempts to illegally cross the border from Belarus to Poland. These are the sections of the border where there is a river or river backwaters. Pontoons are very often used for this.
As temperatures decrease, aid organizations that operate on the border are worried about how people will deal with the coming winter.
We and other organizations operating on the Polish-Belarusian border receive several dozen to several hundred requests for help each month. People who will cross in winter are much more exposed to immediate risk of loss of health or life. Hypothermia is a concern in these very wild conditions. Forests, lakes, rivers, swamps, you can suffer very quickly with hypothermia, especially if you are unaware of such conditions. You do not have the appropriate equipment, you are unprepared.
W taką hipotermię można popaść naprawdę szybko, szczególnie jeśli się jest osobą niespodziewającą się takich warunków, nie ma się odpowiedniego sprzętu, jest się nieprzygotowaną.
There are also a number of people missing whose whereabouts have not been known for months. Coordinations to search for them are not easy.
There are several dozen human lives and a minimum of several dozen families who are fearful sometimes, scared and searching. Among people who cross the Polish-Belarusian border, the number of nationalities and places of origin exceeded 80. So, in fact, there are several dozen Red Cross and Red Crescent associations involved.
A few days ago, the body of a missing man was found in a river. He was identified and buried in Poland. Winter is coming and the conditions in the forests around the border are being more and more difficult. Magdalena Hodownik for Euronews from Warsaw.
An explosion has rocked through Gaza early Friday morning, as Israeli forces say it hit a rocket manufacturing site. The army claimed the attack was in response to 4 rockets fired into Israel a day earlier. The rocket exchange was the first incident of cross-border fighting since August, when 49 Palestinians died in just 2 days. On Thursday, Israeli forces killed 4 Palestinians, one of whom reportedly stabbed a police officer in East Jerusalem. This, as former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu won enough votes in Israel's latest election to return to power, a coalition government made of far-right allies. More than 130 Palestinians have been killed this year in fighting in both the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, making 2022 the deadliest year since 2005. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has touched down in China. It is the first time an EU and G7 leader has traveled to the country since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The trip has been both criticized and overshadowed by Beijing's response to the war in Ukraine, rising tensions over Taiwan, and human rights violations against its Uyghur community. Scholz's delegation is 60% strong, including several business leaders. They received a formal welcome by Chinese President Xi Jinping. Xi spoke of Scholz's visit as an opportunity to deepen cooperation in various fields. And the German Chancellor has stressed that the meeting is intended to build trust and further develop economic cooperation with China. Before the trip, there had been discussions in Germany about Beijing's influence on the country's economy and a possible investment in port facilities in Hamburg.
Iranian protesters clashed with security forces on Thursday in the town of Karaj, west of the capital of Tehran. Hundreds of people blocked the highway that runs through the city and hurled rocks at police vehicles. According to the state-run Iranian media, a paramilitary was killed and 10 policemen were injured. The Iranian authorities assured they have made several arrests and have cleared the highway. The demonstrators gathered to mark the 40th day since the killing of one of the young women that was shot during the uprising. The death of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the morality police mid-September is at the origin of the historical nationwide revolt. But despite the regime's fierce repression, demonstrations have continued for more than 6 weeks all across the country.
There is uproar in France over accusations of racism in the National Assembly. That faint heckle sounded like "Return en Afrique" or "Go back to Africa" in English, directed at black deputy Carlos Bilongo. It took place during a debate on migration and was shouted by a member of the far-right National Rally Party, Gregor de Forna. He denies the accusation, saying that he was referring to migrant boats crossing the Mediterranean and not Bilongo. The parliamentary session was quickly adjourned as condemnations were shouted from across the chamber. On Friday afternoon, parliamentary authorities will meet to decide what, if any, sanctions de Forna should face.
Je fais une suspension de séance de 5 minutes.